So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Robert Joseph. Thank you, Rob.
O tēnei te mihi kia koutou, ki te rangatira mena te little, tēnei te mihi hoki. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel alongside my esteemed colleagues. My very, very short contribution to the discussion today really centres on a report from an independent advisory group that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade established, and that comprised of Colin Keating, Rosalind Noonan, David Cuppy and myself. The report was to provide advice on foreign policy tools that were available and could respond to those grave international situations of concern, including the advantages and disadvantages of a future role for autonomous sanctions. Recognising that sanctions are a tool of last resort, the group considered and advised on the best possible toolkit of foreign policy options and skills that could be employed by Aotearoa New Zealand, well upstream from the point at which sanction regime could be considered. The report was intended to be very much a forward-looking, practical set of recommendations about foreign policy tools and how effective the implementation could be. It included references or reflections drawn from Te Ao Māori and acknowledged, of course, the relevance of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the foreign policy of Aotearoa New Zealand. The report recommended a proactive, preventative approach to situations of those very serious human rights abuses that occur internationally, with the development of mediation and other dispute resolution skills for situations of conflict when they arise. For me, it was beneficial to have the integration of a Te Ao Māori perspective, and for use only as a very last resort, new, carefully constrained legislation establishing generic provisions for the implementation of sanctions. This proposed draft legislation should cover both sanctions approved by the UN Security Council, as well as other categories of sanctions permissible under international law. My short contribution to the panel was to explore a tikanga or a Te Ao Māori approach and discern tikanga tools and whether these new tikanga tools could fit within a proposed conceptual framework. So I thought a couple of ways it could happen. First, as a preventative approach, with the application of concepts such as whanaungatanga to achieve and maintain good relationships globally, regionally, and the whole idea of being a good partner. So really leveraging off those tikanga concepts of reciprocity and also respect to assist to guide that process. This application would seek to strengthen existing situations and or relationships and also underpin new situations and relationships. It would also encourage relationship building and as such was really a proactive approach that could preempt any possible conflicts that may arise. My second idea with respect to a tikanga framework was when an issue had escalated, then that hara or that wrongdoing needed to be identified and a rangatira appointed to initiate the dialogue, and this would happen either bilaterally or multilaterally. Appropriate redress could be considered to heal, achieve harmony. This could include perhaps an apology, a travel ban, arms embargo, and or perhaps financial sanctions. So this approach I considered was nimble and flexible enough to fine-tune an appropriate redress collectively that would be agreed to collectively to overcome those previous problems that had been identified with the unilateral approach, application of sanctions. And this I consider to be a more surgical application of sanctions. In conclusion, we drafted suggested legislation which he actually included in our report. So my question for the Minister was whether I suppose where the report is going and where, if anywhere, the draft legislation may end up. Kia ora, thank you.
I'd like to introduce Professor Dr. Alexander Gillespie, which everybody calls Al. So the floor is yours, Al.
Thanks. Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Minister, for coming. I just want to begin by acknowledging your work over the last few years, because the climate is changing, not just the physical climate, but the political climate. And I just wanted to acknowledge your stewardship in that for our country. I also wanted to start off noting that there's been 3 miracles today. The first one, a minister fell out of the sky. Normally ministers only fall out of the sky when it's field days. And you see them walking around in gumboots, which are very undirty. The second miracle, you've got 4 academics who actually speak and get to the point within 5 minutes, just quite unique. Your third miracle is that you've actually managed to fill a room on campus on a Friday afternoon. But I think you've also made a strategic mistake, if I'm honest, because we've had a lot of debates right now about AUKUS and the threat of large black submarines. I think had you sold it that we were going to buy some yellow submarines, the New Zealand public would be much more open to that. There's two serious things I wish to raise. The first one is this is not a time for utopian thinking. I think for a long time, our foreign policy was focused upon idealistic goals about complete disarmament of the world. And we must always keep this as a further goal in the longer term. But right now, to my mind, the biggest risk is not a war designed rationally, but a war that happens accidentally. And I think the need for the international community for confidence building measures is greater than ever. And this will break into four parts. It's about having hotlines, not just between the highest levels of government, but also the military. It's about making some clear rules which are universal around war games in terms of scale, location, and observers. It's about the importance of notification of missile tests, because at the moment, this is a very ad hoc process and countries can get scared very easily. And finally, with regards to confidence building measures, it's about having better rules for the interactions of our militaries when they shoulder each other into common spaces, be it in the air or be it on the ocean. My second suggestion is that at the moment, New Zealand's foreign policy is like a winter day in the Waikato. It can get very foggy and you can't see where you're going, whether you're going to go left or whether you're going to go right. And you have overseen two fantastic pieces of work. And it is clear that one, that the threats are changing in our world, and that is obvious, and that's good. And it's good that we acknowledge it. And two, that our military needs an upgrade, that it's not fit for purpose for what may be ahead. But what we need, what I think we need now, is a greater compass point about what would we fight for. Because this world, as the United Nations gridlocks, as we see new power blocks emerge, as you see the rise of China, the anger of Russia, the instability of North Korea, the unpredictable nature of Pakistan, and perhaps most scary of them all, the roulette wheel of the American election next year. And all of this, my question is now, are we ANZUS? Are we AUKUS? Are we NATO? Are we neutral? I know we have a relationship with Australia, and that is, I think, very, very important. But when I think about Australia, I worry that if war breaks out with Taiwan and America goes to war over Taiwan, Australia would join America and we have an obligation to defend Australia. I don't know where this ends, but I do think we need to consider what a greater compass point looks like in this. My question to you, Minister, what threat keeps you awake at night? Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of questions coming for the Minister today, so I'm really pleased that I don't have to answer them. But I'm going to hand over now to Andrew to give your remarks. Thank you so much.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Mara, I think, for inviting me to this forum. No, and thank you to all of the other speakers. I think I agree with Professor Gillespie. I think very succinct presentations and very helpful and very astute questions. So look, I had a prepared piece to come here with, so I won't, I've left those notes in my bag. So I will address the questions, but I would just start by saying this, that in terms of what the speakers have said, I agree entirely. The world has changed. I'm old enough to have grown up in the kind of latter half of the what we call the old Cold War and the tensions between the US and what was then the USSR. I still vividly remember in my last year at high school, which the only year I got any prizes, but at the prize giving, one of the prizes I got the award for something, I was allowed to choose what I got. And I chose a book, which was Jonathan Schell's book, The Fate of the Earth. The guest speaker and presenter at our prize giving was the then Prime Minister, Robert Muldoon, who, when I went up to get my prize, took one look at the cover and sort of harumphed. about why would I be wanting to read that sort of thing. But that was the environment I grew up in. That was very in my formative years. So I've always been very conscious of those inter-regional or international conflicts that ultimately do bear upon people's ordinary lives, and they do matter. Later, and if I think about the 1990s and the 2000s, a period described by a variety of world leaders, including our own, as a benign strategic environment. And I think we all accepted that, which is not to say that there weren't dynamics being unleashed around the world that had an impact later on. They certainly did in 2001, and they did later as well. But I don't think, and I don't accept that today can be described as a benign strategic environment that we live in. The reality is the world has changed. I know there's a lot of discussion coming up, particularly from Western countries, about China and the rise of China. There is a lot of good associated with what has happened to China in the last 40 years. It has lifted literally hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty, and that is a good thing. It is a country that is technologically competent and competitive and can do a lot and can contribute a lot. It's a country that the world needs to be engaged in and leading on things like climate change and those universal challenges that we have. So it's important that the world is engaging with China on those things. And as we do, as a small liberal democracy at the bottom end of the world, we engage with a lot of countries who have features about them that we don't agree with, and in some cases we might find abhorrent. I think New Zealand's reputation in the world stage, at least in diplomatic circles, is one of being an honest broker. We take the world as we find it. We speak back to the world as we see it, and that gives us a cachet in forums and conferences around the world that is probably disproportionate to our size and relevance to the world. And that's something we should hold on to. So that's, I think, who we are and where we stand, and the point of leverage, limited as I think, as Reuben acknowledged, but nevertheless, we do have a point of leverage that is of some value. The other point I would make is that when we think about the change in the world, although China has grown significantly in terms of its economic power and its diplomatic power and its place in the world, it also chooses to conduct itself in a way that is antithetical to the conduct of good international relations. We know of what happens within its borders and the human rights abuses and those things. We know that it's not a democratic country, and it proudly, it doesn't conceal that. It considers it's a very important part of the way it gets to run it itself. And its common defense to criticisms of itself is, we're a sovereign nation, let us do what we like. And at one level, as liberal people growing up in a liberal democracy, we respect others, but actually non-democratic, and in some cases anti-democratic organizations or countries or institutions are not what we subscribe to. One of the things we know that China does is when it engages with countries, and we see this specifically in the Pacific, is that it typically does so to the exclusion of established international institutions. And so its engagement with the Pacific is in spite of, and sometimes antithetical to, the Pacific Islands Forum. It doesn't respect that forum, and it doesn't respect the collective self-determining approach of the Pacific Islands Forum. And we also know that the way it conducts itself is it engages in a not very transparent way with its diaspora, wherever it is. And it happens in New Zealand, it happens in the islands, it happens in other countries of the world too. And those are ways of behaving that are not consistent with our liberal democratic values. And we have to acknowledge that. The next point I'd make is, why have we released these documents recently? Why do we find ourselves talking more about these sorts of things? From the time I've been a minister and I've been responsible for the intelligence agencies, it has always been my wish and hope, and supported by the first two directors of the two organisations I dealt with, to be more open about what those agencies do and the issues they're dealing with. That was given further kind of impetus by the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the mosque attacks in Christchurch, where that 850-page report, and I read every page of it, and I was interviewed and so on by them. They made the point that we actually, as a country, need to be more open about national security challenges that we've got. That's the mark of political maturity and social and cultural maturity, that we can talk about these things, and we need to talk about these things, and the government needs to be able to talk about these things. And so that was important, and the recent review of the legislation covering those agencies, conducted by Sir Terence Arnold, former Supreme Court Justice, and Matanuku Mahuika, made the same point. And so I'm very pleased that I think we are getting to a point now where, because I think the government has a responsibility to be more open about national security issues and challenges and threats, and we can get this stuff out. There's a point I made in a speech I gave last year, which is also championing the cause of more openness, is one of the strengths we have, and it may well be at risk, as I think as speakers have acknowledged, is our level of social cohesion. So in a country where we are still, the Crown is still reconciling its appalling behaviour to our Indigenous peoples, and we have welcomed so many people from other parts of the world, and we have a significant array of other ethnic communities. We enjoy a level of social cohesion that many other countries would struggle to achieve. But it will require efforts to maintain that. I acknowledge that. But one of our best chances of ensuring our national security and our sense of national security is maintaining social cohesion, and we only do that when we follow the traditional liberal democratic value of being open and transparent about what government does, including in the national security space. So that's kind of where we're getting to. Part of national security is what we do in defence. We have defence reviews periodically, and we've had one recently, and that's kind of, we're now moving into another phase on that. So that's kind of by way of laying out my kind of foundations. I'll come to the questions that have been posed. So Valmaine, you asked about the autonomous sanctions or approach to sanctions, both autonomous and mandated by the UN, and appreciate that. We have, in both governments, I know, because when we were in opposition, we had the same discussions, have struggled with an autonomous sanctions regime, because as a small country, if we have that ability, we do run the risk of being muscled by bigger countries. You must do this, in our border interests. So we've always been hesitant about it. And I think then we were challenged with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and knowing what that represented and the threat that posed, we made the judgment that actually we do need, and the Security Council was incapable of doing anything because Russia's right of veto, that we had to be part of an international movement to do something about it. And so we would never act alone, but we would act if there is sufficient community of interest and consistent with our values, and that's what we ended up doing. So we passed special legislation in relation to Russia. But I think, to answer your question about where are the proposals at, I think we are poised now to have, I think, a more robust discussion about the very proposals that you put up. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't develop a political consensus fairly soon about an autonomous sanctions regime, and your work will have been very helpful in that respect. So that's where I predict that getting to. Come to Reuben's question. Just on your analysis, Reuben, I acknowledge your point about the kind of the US security order and the kind of the Chinese-Russian security order. I would just make the point that I think things are a little more fluid than just, they're not stark groupings. If I look at the work we are doing, we work closely with a number of Southeast Asian nations, including India, which is deeply embedded in the kind of, or closer to the Russia, if not certainly not China, but close to the Russia kind of friendship sort of circle, but nevertheless is nervous about what is happening in terms of their representations to us. So, and we work with the Malaysia and other of those Southeast Asian countries, because we've had long-standing interest in that sort of area. And likewise, our relationship with China is not one-dimensional; it's multi-dimensional, as you'd expect in this modern world. But we have to be alert to what are threats in any relationship that we have. But to your point about what you describe as a distinction between kind of the urgency described in the current situation in those recent documents and our decision-making on investments, the reality is when it comes to defence investments, particularly for the big kit, if you call it that way, because the next big decisions we have to make will be about the Navy and our naval equipment, is first of all getting, even if we were to put in an order today, we wouldn't expect delivery for another 3 or 4 years. So, but we do have some very serious assessments to make of what makes sense for us to equip ourselves with. And to turn to Leilani's point, we have long recognised, both through our engagement with the Pacific Islands Forum and the likes of the Bow Declaration and others, the defining an existential national security threat to our Pacific Island neighbours is climate change, as you've said. So we have to think, even in terms of our defence capabilities, what should we equip ourselves with to support our Pacific Island neighbours? Because we are and will continue to be called upon to assist. We need to be able to assist them with preventive measures through the rest of our foreign affairs and aid program. But when weather events strike, when other disasters happen like volcanoes and earthquakes, we are often the first to be called upon, and we need to be equipped to respond. So those are the big decisions. Do we continue with 9 vessels of 6 different classes, or do we kind of rationalize? Do we need to be bigger? Do we need different capabilities? So those are the big questions that we need to answer. So that's what happens there. I might add, as a general overarching theme too, as a country, if it was just left, if the only thing we had to worry about was our own territorial defence, New Zealand could not defend ourselves. We don't expect our Pacific Island neighbours to be able to defend themselves on their own. Our defence and our national security is inherently tied up in our relationships with others, and that's our contributions to others, but also what we might expect of them in return. And so those relationships are absolutely critical. And I think it is why, not just us, but many countries in our region are openly and transparently exploring and accentuating relationships that we all see will assist us in the event that the international situation deteriorates, and in the event that there is conflict of whatever nature. So that's a range of questions that we have to consider. And then Professor Gillespie, to turn to your question. So, Leilani, did I answer your principal question was how concerned am I about these Solomon Islands Security Pact? My concern is not about the Solomon Islands as a sovereign state making its decision. Of course, it's going to do that. And we continue to have a relationship with Solomon Islands, continues to turn to New Zealand and Australia to assist with their security measures, and they are specifically asked us to contribute to security around the Pacific Games. So, we will do that. My concern about it is, and with all due respect to the Solomon Islands, there is a political culture there which is prone to, if I'm perfectly blunt, corruption, and that is a political environment in which China is quite happy to engage in. And I think underpinning some of these new international relationships formalized in agreements is some unhealthy political conduct that we wouldn't tolerate in our country. So that's my concern, is that the vulnerability is being exploited, and in the long run, it's not a healthy long-term relationship. To turn to Professor Gillespie's questions, the ultimate questions are what keeps me awake at night. I don't want to say I'm kind of a Zen type of guy, but sometimes you do just have to block out what you've seen during the day and just in order to get a good night's sleep. But if I go to some of the underpinning questions, what would we fight for? And the reason we are supporting Ukraine, and ours is more limited support than many others. When you go to Europe, and I was there in April at one of the donor conferences there is no question that for most European countries, they regard themselves as on a war footing because they feel very threatened by Russia's conduct. For us, why did we engage in it? Because as a small country, we need the international rules-based order to work and to protect all countries, including us. And I know China poses the question, but not entirely illegitimately, well, whose order is it? Because that's the question they pose. The answer they give in reality is, we don't respect anything other than our idea of order. And it's not about what's negotiated at a multilateral level, it's what they choose to interpret it as. That's their approach to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's the way we choose to interpret it. So what would we fight for? We fight for which was the product of World War II, is a set of institutions and conventions that create order between countries, which is the best hope we've got to prevent exploitation and repression, which were the big challenges for the world leading up to and following World War II. So that's, in my view, what we should fight for. We are a country that embraces democracy and liberal values, and they are under threat. They're including under threat from like-minded countries, if we're brutally honest about that. The other question was, are we ANZUS, are we AUKUS, are we NATO? We are a combination of things, and we explore our international relationships with all their dimensions: trade, diplomatic, people to people, all the rest of it, in a way that it hopefully is consistent with our values and ultimately gives us the best chance of being able to protect ourselves through those good quality relationships. What keeps me awake at night? If I'm brutally honest, I would say it is that we don't allow a good, robust discussion to take place in this country about the threats we face and about the actions that we should take to address those. Because there won't be a single answer, and there will be multiple dimensions to it. But we do need to confront those issues, uncomfortable as they may be, and we need to arrive at something that we can all live with. So thank you again for all being here this afternoon. Look forward to our questions and discussion.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much, Andrew Little, for your responses to all those questions. And I'll have to make a brief confession before we go to the Q&A. This is not how I sold it to Andrew. I told him he was coming to Hamilton, and he'd probably be talking to a bunch of students. And instead, he's got a huge number of curly questions from 4 very impressive academics. So yeah, just a public apology to Andrew. And thank you for pivoting so seamlessly into a very different response. So thank you so much for that. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions. I just have 3 requirements for these. Can you please raise your hand if you have a question for anybody on the panel? Could you please say who you are? You can sit down or stand up, but please say who you are, who your question is for, and then what your question is. And if I could just politely ask, not for any long opinionated pieces or diatribes about any kind of topic, because there's a lot of forums for that. You can write in the conversation or any other forum. So please just keep your questions to the point. So just say who you are, who your question is for, and what your question is, and priority will be for students, because that was the original pitch, Andrew. So if you're a student and you've got a question, put your hand up and we'll try to get to as many as possible before 1:10. So anybody got a question? Not to put off the academics, because we're very grateful to have you all here. Some of my former colleagues from Te Wharenga, thank you so much for coming. But does anybody have a question? Dylan. Thank you, Dylan. Oh, thank you.
Leading domestic threat, I would say, is foreign interference and foreign influence. I can tell you, because I said this to a journalist recently, and it will be published in a couple of weeks' time, is that probably 50% of our intelligence agency's effort goes into dealing with foreign interference and foreign influence. And then I'd say, secondly, and allied to that is disinformation and misinformation. And the challenge for that is knowing where a line is drawn, where something should be done about it, given our New Zealand Bill of Rights Act and our commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. It was characterised to me recently as drawing the distinction between lawful and awful, and lawful but awful, and stuff that infringes on others' rights, that justifies an intervention. And I think our political establishment is struggling to find where that line is.
Very good. Anybody, does anybody have a question? Any students or any academics or anybody else who has come along today? Questions? Oh, hi Dee.
I think about security. I'd love to comment about New Zealand being such a small country, but being important. I've always admired about this. I think we get to this country really beautifully. My question to you is that if China is a threat in this, it sounds like they're going to deal with security issues. So is there plans for New Zealand or the Pacific in general to form a pact like that has been done with Australia, Japan, and the UK, where they must, whether they're ready to respond to a threat quite quickly?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, look, we don't have any plans to join any more kind of formal arrangements or alliances. We regard ourselves as having one formal ally, and that's Australia. The rest are partners. We have long-standing relationships. Well, I think about the 5-power defence arrangement, which is us, Australia, UK, Malaysia, and Singapore. That's been in place for over 50 years. Very strong relationships, and that's a defence relationship. We have a more recent one, the Friends arrangement, which is France, Australia, New Zealand, which is more about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But we work closely with France and obviously Australia and the South Pacific. And I do remind people sometimes that you get questioned about, well, why we belong to this partnership or that partnership. Let's not forget that since World War II, even before World War II, New Zealand has only been invaded or attacked by another sovereign state once since then. It was in 1985, and it was France when they bombed the Rainbow Warrior. That was a state-backed incursion on our territory, and it killed somebody and harmed others. So, but we have a very healthy relationship with France today. So I don't think we will, but the reality is we will be part of partnerships as we are at the moment. I think the other thing I'd say is we should not think that we won't be called on to help or assist. I think one of the classic situations we face is if conflict breaks out in the South China Sea. We have a huge stake in that because $20 billion of our trade goes through there every year. Those trade routes are closed down or restricted or limited. We have a direct interest in that. So if we are asked to provide some support or means or some policing duties or what have you, then we almost certainly will have to agree to do so. We do at the moment. So we're part of a network of many countries that police the sanctions against North Korea. We've done it in the past through aerial surveillance. We almost certainly will again in the future as well. So I think it's important for our longer term national security interests that we play our part to defend our interests and the interests of others aligned with us.
Sorry, I do have a question. So if looking at China's foreign policy in the past, if they are going to affect, they will be silently and surprise. They won't be much. So are we prepared to respond to and
Yeah, so look, I think that's part of the kind of the ongoing thinking. But what I would say of China is they are engaged extensively throughout the world because they need to. They can't feed their people on their own. They need the rest of the world to assist in that. They can't provide all the technology they need on their own. They are reliant on other parts of the world for that. Whether it's rare earth minerals, whether it's materials. Notwithstanding their kind of technologically advanced economy, they still reliant on engagement with the rest of the world. I think the other observation that is often made of China is they learn quickly. So they want relationships with the world, and they might want it on their terms that we might initially find agreeable. But in the end, they want relationships. And when things don't work, they will find a way to have relationships. And I think what my observation again only is the kind of wolf warrior mentality that was behind their kind of sweep through the Pacific last year, trying to get a whole bunch of Pacific Island countries to sign up to their 10-point sort of security plan. Didn't work. It won't mean they won't want those relationships in the future, but I think they learned very quickly that that's not the way to go about it. I think the big challenge for China will be whether or not they can participate in even regional multilateral arrangements as well as the global ones, and that remains the challenge and potentially remains the source of conflict if they don't.
Yep.
Brian Cole from Research Enterprise. Minister, how will the defence go about addressing the skills shortage that they currently have so that it continues to operate from Antarctica all the way up to the Pacific with the new kit that's going to come online?
Yep, that's I mean, one of the issues that they're facing, and as other militaries are around the world at the moment, is a loss of people, a loss of skills and talent. And we've still got a bit of work to do. My first call today was actually at the Defence recruiting office here, just to check out how it's going, because they are competing. Young people now have a myriad of choices, and we've got to make the choice to be part of our NZDF an attractive one. not just in remuneration, but in activity and stuff. And the world of defence work is changing too. So it's, again, more technologically oriented. So we've taken the first step to significantly increase remuneration, particularly in those areas where we were clearly way off the mark. I'm not sure we've kind of completed that task even at this point. But the other is to make sure we're clear about what the work opportunities are, what the skills are that we can offer people. I was talking to the now outgoing Defence Secretary in the UK, Ben Wallace, a few months ago, and he said the British Defence, where their thinking is at now, is they don't ever expect it to be up to the complement that they were at, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And so the challenge for them now is, with the complement that they think they can get to, is to ensure that the technology that they adopt means they get to have the same effect that they once did with that number of people. So there's a bit of a transfer from human effort to technology substitution for the same effect. And I suspect we'll be engaging in that equation too.
Yep, down the back.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I think that's the reason for much greater openness about a national security strategy, but also the security threatscape that we released a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, is for the same reason. So look, we get it out there, we talk about it, because I know that there are people who feel threatened by that, but who are reluctant to come forward and be open about it. So that's, I think, part of the role of government is to be open about what we see, what our intelligence is, and that's why we're getting that out there. In terms of, when is enough enough? The reality is, we will manage the multidimensional relationship carefully. We do have a significant trade relationship. I mean, part of the work we've been doing in the last couple of 3 years is talking to exporters in New Zealand about diversification of the markets they trade into. And one of the reasons we've put a lot of effort into growing the number of trade agreements we've got is precisely that. So those opportunities are there. Some are responsive to that, others aren't. But look, we will continue to manage that relationship. But when we see an action like Russia against Ukraine that offends against not just the values but our strategic interests, then we've got to, in concert with others, take appropriate action. I think one of the kind of conundrums that much of the West is dealing with is, from the 1970s, we all kind of signed up to the one China policy. It was a bit of a kind of diplomatic fudge in order to establish relations with China. And it is what gets repeated back to us now by Beijing when we think about Taiwan's interests. But at an objective level, we would say of Taiwan, it's a free and democratic country or economy, to use the China-friendly language, and it's self-determining, and we promote and encourage and respect that, and we would want that to continue. So those are the values we hold, but we will make practical and pragmatic decisions if called upon to do so to uphold that.
Oh, we've got, okay, I'll go over here and then Alberto. So, yeah.
Sure. Yep.
You mentioned that it's a session about how
Yep.
actually we know how it's with China
Yeah. Look, I think look, China will say what it wants. An important part of the way we conduct our relationship with China is the engagement we have, the person-to-person engagement at the political level. The critical thing is, to avoid anything being a surprise. I think we work hard at that. I think we can reasonably predict what responses are to various actions. There was a response to the documents that we released. That's their right to react in the way that they did, but it wasn't outside kind of the realms of possibility. They are a country that in the last 20 years has increased its spending on its military tenfold. It will soon have, I think, the largest navy in the world. So look, it's arranging its posture to meet its needs. And if we are to use the defence it often affords itself, which is we're a sovereign nation, we'll make decisions for ourselves, we would say any criticism from China, we're a sovereign nation, we'll make decisions for ourselves. I should add, one of the things part of the capability question we've got is one of the things we haven't done particularly well is discharge our obligations in the Southern Ocean. And so we've kind of signed up to the rest of the world that we would, police it against illegal, unreported and unlawful fishing. We just don't do much of that. So one of the capabilities we have to think about amongst everything else is the ability to operate in the Southern Ocean to perform that role. And we know adjacent to the Southern Ocean is of course Antarctica, and that is becoming a contested region too. So this is the reality we've got.
Thank you. All right, Alberto, you might end up being the last one. It's 112. Where you go?
Question for the minister. What are the international scenarios that New Zealand sees as likely in the event of a second Trump administration?
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of those things that people are struggling to enter the kind of the thought process to deal with. Look, we all have to. But I don't have any thoughts, and neither have I had any advice I might have about change in stance or posture as a result of that. I think we can predict that there will be under a second Trump administration a further retreat from international, if not international institutions, certainly international obligations. I think if you look in our the Indo-Pacific region and you see what the likes of Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, some of the bigger nations there, and even countries like Vietnam, what they're doing and strengthening relationships with others in the region, a lot of that is to take account of the contingency that the US won't be there at the level or in the form that might have been expected, let's say 10 years ago. The world is preparing and also hoping, but not necessarily for the same things.
Okay, we're going to do very last one. Mason over here, last question from Mason.
Not at all. Yeah, it's a great question. I came to politics from what used to be known as the Engineers Union. It's had a number of names since, but the union that represented folks in the manufacturing and fabrication sector as well, and the heavy engineering sector. And you will know that in the 1980s, and Margaret Wilson will well recall the debates we had when we were purchasing frigates. We had the option of 4, we chose 2. Some components of the frigates, including the superstructure, were fabricated in New Zealand as part of an arrangement that we had. But also some of the other technology and facilities in those frigates were manufactured here in New Zealand. I think HVAC and some of the radio equipment and all the rest of it. So I think one of the challenges for defence procurement is to see what we can do for the benefit of New Zealand industry. I think probably the lesson we've learned is we look to trusted partners. So we look to countries with established defence industries who can provide the equipment that we've got. It's interesting, when I was in Turkey earlier in the year, and they made a big thing about a big presentation to me about the extent of their defence industry, what they make, what they do, and how good it is. And it kind of blew me away. I didn't realise how big a defence industry that they had. We source our defence kit from a variety of countries, but it is true we look to the US, Australia, and the UK for a lot of it. Not exclusively, but it is a lot of it because, as I say, trusted suppliers, trusted industries. But I think there is scope for us through our procurement arrangements is to look for some New Zealand input. And I know that there's, between New Zealand and Australia has a much larger and more developed defence industry. Some discussion going on at the moment about some partnering between those 2 countries about some work that could happen here that would benefit New Zealand but contribute to our defence material. So that is a question that is very much alive in future procurement.
Oh no, what am I going to do?
One more, we can do one more.
All right,
Good.
last one?
Yeah.
Okay, very last one, Dylan Woodhouse.
Just perhaps an idea of if we want to build some of our domestic infrastructure, maybe we should be looking to training those to pursue a more asymmetric strategy. And if we're not going to do that, we're going to still be a consumer of security from our key partners. How can we avoid being seen to?
I'm not sure we're seen as the weakest link. It is true, many partners say, like what you're doing, do a lot more of it. But equally, Ukraine is, as you will know, through the Ukraine Defence Cooperation Group, heavily reliant on military technology from other countries, a lot of being donated at the moment. They have certainly developed some expertise in drone technology, which has been incredibly useful for them. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, one area where we are ahead of Australia and indeed many other countries is in space technology, largely thanks to Rocket Lab. But actually, there are other companies heavily investing in research and development for technology operating, in the stratosphere and above ionosphere and what have you. So we are well ahead in many respects. That will be, and I know that in terms of the Defence Capability Review, which is the next phase coming from those documents, that's an area of technology that will be actively explored in terms of future defence capability, drawing on our own domestic capability here.
I deal with the international relationships. I wanted to ask you, with our trading session we just had in regard to the Talisman Sampling 23 trading, Were they able to come back with some insider knowledge as to where the arts to other level of standard?
Yep.
I mean, did we learn anything from that training session while we were there?
Yeah, we always learn, and those exercises are important. We also have just recently completed an exercise in Fiji. We've got Talisman Sabre we've just completed, and we've got Bersama Lima coming up, which is our annual 5 Powers Defence Arrangement exercise. A lot of that is about keeping skills current. One of the problems with COVID, both the shutdown of the borders, but also tying up many of our defence personnel and providing security for our MIQ facilities, as they lost the opportunity for that training, they lost the currency. So those training exercises right now are contributing a huge amount. And I think what we find, and I've had this from senior officers from other militaries, is we command huge respect for the capabilities that we have. They might not be as extensive as, you know, the likes of the US and Australia, but what we do and what we commit ourselves to, we are regarded as very well trained and very well skilled in. An example that was given to me is, and it's somewhat small by comparison, but one of the big exercises they had in the Pacific last year, the US only wanted their naval vessels to be refueled by one refueling vessel, and that was Aotearoa. Actually means it's Aotearoa, because we turned up on time, we got the job done, it was safe, it was trusted, and we were out of there and they could carry on doing what they do. It's not just refueling naval ships. The exercise out of Australia, the Talisman Sabre, the feedback I got was the stuff that we were tasked to do and committed to doing, we did incredibly well and got good feedback for. So, yeah, we do well.
All right. On that note, I am going to wind us up because we've gone way over time. And I just want to thank you very much again, Andrew, for coming here. I think it's a really fortunate thing that we've got this panel of speakers to come to Hamilton on a Friday afternoon and talk. So I think we're all really very grateful for that.